Last time in part 1, I looked at the problem of evil and how it influences the origins debate. It traces back at least to the Epicureans in antiquity. They debated against the Stoics about origins, and for the Epicureans, the problem of evil forces you to conclude that God must be distanced from the world. A good God, all-knowing, all-perfect, all-good God would not have created this bad world, too many evils in the world. So God must not be personally involved in the creation or design of the world. God must be distanced from the world. And we saw that this argument has a lot of theological content. So we're going to talk about these different theological traditions and beliefs that influence the origins debate, that drive the origins debate and origins thinking. Now, once you have distanced God from the world like this because of the problem of evil, if you argue that God needs to come into the world to design and create things because they're so complicated, which was one of the Stoics' arguments, then it seems incongruous. So that was a second argument that we're going to talk about today in this video, again by the Epicureans, that, wait, we've got God distanced from the world. Now you're saying he comes into the world and tweaks things every once in a while. That's incongruous. This argument is called the Deus ex Machina argument in reference to a theatrical device that the Greeks used in their dramas, in their plays. God out of the machine, Deus ex Machina. So that was a theatrical device where you have a basket, perhaps, that's suspended by a crane. It can be lowered and raised. So when the hero of the play is in trouble, suddenly you have this basket lowered down and a godlike character comes out and saves the day. So you can imagine you're watching this play and things are getting tense, and then all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, this basket is lowering down and saving the day somehow. It's incongruous. And so that was the idea. That was what the Epicureans made reference to in their criticism of the Stoics. You're like the Greek poets using this Deus ex Machina to save the day. So that's where the term comes from, and you can see there is, again, theological content to this argument. God wouldn't do it that way. God would not intervene in the world. It's an argument against divine intervention of any sort. God must be distanced from the world. If you say that God is a designer or a creator of specific things in the world, that's a Deus ex Machina type of an argument, type of a sin. You've created the Deus ex Machina sin. God wouldn't do that. Now, we could stop the video, this part 2 right here. There's the second argument, but this is similar to another argument that comes along later. So I'm going to continue on. Fast forward to the 1600s, 17th century. An English scholar named Ralph Cudworth made a very similar argument. Now, he disagreed with the Epicureans that the world randomly arose. The world arose by these random means. For the Epicureans, remember, is random motion, these random atoms swirling around, occasionally creating things. That was ridiculous. Cudworth could see that that's just going to be unlikely. The world is not going to fortuitously come together like that. But Cudworth agreed with the Epicureans on those two religious arguments. The problem of evil, he said, yeah, there are these errors and bungles in the world. So he agreed on the problem of evil argument. God would not have personally created the specifics of this world. Cudworth also agreed with the Epicureans' Deus ex Machina argument, except he tweaked it a little bit. It's a little bit different in the hands of the great English scholar. Cudworth said it's unbecoming of God. It's beneath his dignity. God wouldn't stoop down and do this. Think of the worms and the crustacea and the insects, the mites and the flies. Is God going to come in and create the bodies of these little creatures, muck it up in the dirt, so to speak, in the mud? God wouldn't get down to that level for Cudworth. So it's very similar to the Deus ex Machina, but a little bit different. The Deus ex Machina was it's incongruous for God to come in like that. Here it's beneath his dignity. Let me give you an analogy to help you understand the feeling here behind it. Imagine you check into a hotel that's owned by a rich and famous person. Someone, let's say Tom Cruise, for example. Famous, rich person owns this hotel. You go stay in this hotel, you check into the room, and the room is a mess. You call the room service at the front desk, and you say, hey, I just checked in, and this room has not been cleaned. What's going on here? And they say, we'll bring someone right away and clean that up. hang on. And so in a minute, there's a knock at the door. You answer the door, and it's Tom Cruise standing there in a tuxedo. And he's got one of those carts, you see that the maids use to clean the rooms. And he's got mops and brooms and things. And he says, let me clean this up right away. I see your room is not clean. He's got a tuxedo on. He takes a mop and he gets down in a rag and he's some cleaning fluids. And he gets down on his hands and knees and he's down there washing the floor and so forth. You would feel a little bit awkward, no? You just feel, wait a minute, someone else should be doing this. That's the sort of idea here. It's beneath God's dignity to be mucking it up in the mud and creating these insects and all the details of the world. Now, Cudworth's ideas were largely picked up by a leading botanist named John Ray. Ray, for many people, is the father of British natural theology. Natural theology was an influential, powerful movement from roughly 1700 to 1850. And its basic argument was there are evidences and signs of the Creator in the creation. Everything is so complicated, so well adapted, you can see the signs of the Creator in the creation. Also, there's just beauty and harmony and things like that. It wasn't always adaptation for the natural theologians. John Ray wrote a very influential book right around the turn of the century, around 1700, 7 editions of this book actually, on all of these different evidences and so forth. So he's kind of the father of natural theology, a hero of the faith, a leading Christian thinker. But he did agree with Cudworth's ideas on the problem of evil, yes, and this infra dignitatem argument. God wouldn't stoop down and create these things. Both Cudworth and Ray consequently believed in a concept of a plastic nature. This is an intermediary between God and the world. So you have God coming up with here's what we need to do. We're going to create this world. The plastic nature is kind of the implementer, creating the world. And so that's why we have these bad things in the world. And it solves the infra dignitatem problem. This infra-dig idea remained influential in the following centuries. In the 18th century, for example, the leading French scientist, Georges Louis Leclerc, or otherwise the Count of Buffon, made this sort of an argument as well. It was an indignity to think of God creating the wings of insects. In the 19th century, Charles Darwin, Robert Chambers, and Alfred Wallace were among leading scientists or leading thinkers who made this sort of an argument. Chambers wrote an influential book. He wasn't really a scientist, he was a publisher, but he wrote an influential book about origins named Vestiges of the Creation. Vestiges came out in 1844, and it was more like science fiction than science, but it was influential. It inspired a lot of debate, and it cleared the way for Darwin in many ways. Darwin's 1859 book on the origin of species. Chambers made this infra-dig argument as well. Surely it would be ridiculous to envision God personally interfering with every detail of the biological world, argued Chambers. Wallace likewise. Wallace was inspired by Chambers' Vestiges, and Wallace also made these sorts of infra dignitatem arguments. He was thinking of the orchid, for example, all the details of the orchid. And surely it would be a far worthier conception to think of these things, these such details coming about by natural law rather than the direct hand of God, of the Creator. Now, Darwin, in his private notebooks, made these sorts of observations that surely it is not worthy of interposition, wrote Darwin in his notebooks, for God to be doing these details of the world. Chambers and Wallace, of course, did not have access to Darwin's private notebooks. Those were published much later. So you can see these ideas were in the air. There is no clear lineage between these different thinkers. Yes, Wallace may have picked it up from Chambers, but when you see it in Darwin's private notebooks, that's an independent source there. No big surprise here. These ideas were in the air. This was a popular idea. At that time, there was a painting that came out, 1849 or 1850, by John Millais, a great English painter in the 19th century. and a child prodigy, and he painted this painting, Christ in the House of His Parents. And it's a great painting. It's a painting, it shows Jesus as a young boy in his father's carpentry shop. But it's very realistic. There's scraps of wood all over the floor. He's just a normal little kid. And he injures his hand, and his mother, Mary, is there attending to his bloody hand. And of course, there's symbolism there. But the painting was scathingly reviewed. And the problem there was this, well, at least partly, this infra dignitatem problem. It was beneath the dignity. It was all too real. The details of the Holy Family there, they were just like a normal family, and there's this scrawny little kid here. And they just couldn't, the English society rejected it. Well, it's a great painting, and Millais comes out of it known as one of the great painters of the 19th century, great English painters. But that's just another example of how these ideas were in the culture. So you can imagine coming up with, if you're working on a theory that God didn't create the world personally, how that might be received. In the 20th century, you have evolutionists such as J.B.S. Haldane saying God must have an inordinate fondness of beetles. There's so many hundreds of thousands of species of beetles. Ken Miller, in his book Finding Darwin's God, makes fun of God creating these different species of elephants. Boy, he must be a stickler for details and repetition. So by this time, you're just getting sarcasm. It's a given. God would not create these details. It's difficult to underestimate the influence of these religious ideas, or of this religious idea in this case. We're talking about infra dignitatem, a spin-off of Deus ex machina. So you have Deus ex machina going back to the Epicureans. You still see it sometimes today, but its cousin, its very similar cousin, infra dignitatem, is what we're talking about now. And this is a very popular, common, persuasive, influential theological tradition going strong when Darwin was working on his theory of evolution. And it's very difficult to underestimate the impact of this. Science is not an objective, fact-driven process where you're just like a Baconian machine taking in bits of data and churning out new truths. It's a social process, and today there's a replication crisis in science. We have research studies coming up with new therapies for diseases. Pharmaceuticals get interested in this. They pick up the idea. They're going to commercialize it, and their first step is what? To reproduce it. Let's take this study and reproduce it, and then let's work on commercializing it. Well, the very first step so often is a failure. Boss, I couldn't get that to work. I can't get the same results they got in the paper from those academics. It's a problem in science right now with things that we're able to try and reproduce. The problem is, as Del Ratch said, science is done by people, and people have agendas, they have desires, they're goal-seeking. We are naturally goal-seeking entities, goal-seeking agents. When people start a scientific study, they've got results in mind. They've got things that they would like to accomplish. They have a certain sort of result they'd like to get. So you maybe ignore those data that don't work so well and just use these data. You filter out the data. Use this algorithm rather than that algorithm. Use this presentation style. Use this chart, or this graph, not that graph. P-hacking. Use this P result rather than that P result. So it happens, unfortunately. All too often it happens in science. These are in studies that we're able to actually check and evaluate and find out whether it was actually correct or not. Imagine all of the science that we're not able to check, such as origins science, such as evolutionary theory. Here you have evolutionists saying, well, Darwin's saying he's discovered this idea of that, gee, God wasn't involved, the world arose by itself. That's interesting. How did that work? Well, there's a lot of underlying religious ideas. We're going to look at a lot more coming up. We're looking at this infra dignitatem, and it was influential at the time. It's hard to underestimate that. As Charlie Munger says, show me the incentive, I'll show you the result. Well, here we have an incentive. There was a religious idea strongly influencing the thinking, both in the arts and sciences, in Darwin's time. Religion drives science, and it matters.